You have to be able to get over your fears if you want to be a good UFC fighter. When someone steps into the octagon, they're doing something that most people will never do. From Megan Anderson to Jon Jones, here are all the times UFC fighters were afraid of their opponents. Starting with Megan Anderson versus Amanda Nunes.
Amanda, the Lioness!
Megan Anderson finally got her chance to fight for the UFC featherweight title at UFC 259 in Las Vegas. Amanda Nunes, the MMA GOAT for women, was on the other side of the octagon. Now, anyone would be scared to fight the Lioness in a cage. Megan Anderson's face showed that she was feeling the pressure. She even tried to look tough at the press conference, but as soon as the fight started, clearly the Aussie didn't want anything to do with Nunes. When Nunes landed her first big blow, Anderson did the chicken dance because her legs were shaking. She went down quickly after Nunes hit her with another punch and gave up quickly. The whole fight was over in just 2 minutes. It wasn't a surprise that the UFC let go of Megan Anderson soon after UFC 259, but it's not always people like the Lioness scaring opponents. The next fighter had a funny title, but was still someone to be scared of. It's Demetrious Johnson versus Chris Carriasso. Now, most people would laugh at the idea of being scared of a fighter named Mighty Mouse, who only weighs 125 pounds. But Demetrious Johnson, the UFC flyweight champion, was a scary opponent in the octagon. During his run for the UFC title, Johnson knocked out Joe Benavidez, Kyoji Horiguchi, and Triple C Henry Cejudo. At UFC 178 in September 2014, Johnson fought Chris Carriasso, who wasn't a likely contender for the title. No one thought the 17-5 fighter from Arizona had a chance against the champion at the time. Carriasso looked scared and overwhelmed as he walked into the octagon. The challenger did well to make it through the first round, but he was tapped out 2 minutes and 30 seconds into the second round. He just didn't stand a chance.
Weight champion Demetrious Mighty Mouse Johnson!
Sometimes even UFC heavyweights lose their footing. I'm talking about Brock Lesnar in his match against Alistair Overeem. Brock Lesnar is known as the Beast Incarnate in the WWE. He used to be a UFC heavyweight champion, but at UFC 141 in 2011, he looked more like a scared lamb when he fought MMA legend Alistair Overeem. Overeem was fighting in his first UFC match, and Lesnar was fighting for the first time since he had diverticulitis. During the face-off and fighter instructions, Lesnar, who's usually very scary, was very shy. Once the fight started, Overeem hit Lesnar's body with precise and powerful knees. At 2:26 of the first round, he kicked Lesnar in the liver and punched him, ending the fight. Brock Lesnar's first MMA retirement was caused by the Demolition Man, who lived up to his name. Now that must have been super embarrassing for him. Probably not as embarrassing as when this next top UFC light heavyweight champion was scared. Let's go back to Anthony Johnson versus Ryan Bader in the ring. Anthony Rumble Johnson is one of MMA's most terrifying knockout artists, so it's not surprising that top UFC light heavyweight contender Ryan Bader looked scared when he met Rumble. The main event of UFC on Fox 18 on January 30th, 2016 was between two UFC veterans. The winner got a chance to fight for the light heavyweight title. Bader had won his last 5 fights before this one, but it was clear immediately that he was afraid of Johnson's power. After Bader tried hard to get a takedown, Johnson quickly put him on his back. Johnson then pounded him with powerful punches until the fight was over in less than 90 seconds. Impressive, sure, but it's clearly not on the same level as this next fighter who scares everyone who's ever gone against him or will go against him. It's everyone versus Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou, the new heavyweight champion of the UFC, is the scariest fighter in MMA. He's knocked out people 10 times in the UFC. Former UFC champions Andrei Arlovski, Cain Velasquez, Stipe Miocic, and Junior Dos Santos have all been knocked out by the Predator. The Cameroonian fighter has also knocked out top contender Curtis Blaydes twice and MMA legend Alistair Overeem in a brutal way. It wouldn't be fair to pick out just one fighter who was scared of the new champion. Now let's not forget about the most interesting fight of all, Ronda Rousey versus Holly Holm. This iconic fight went down at UFC 193 in 2015. Rousey was the reigning bantamweight champion and was considered one of the best female fighters in the world, but Holly Holm wasn't intimidated intimidated by Rousey's reputation. No way. She entered the octagon with a plan to defeat her. During the fight, it was clear that Rousey feared Holm's striking ability. Rousey had been dominant in her previous fights, relying on her grappling skills to finish her opponents. But Holm was a former professional boxer, and Rousey seemed unsure of how to handle her striking. Holm exploited this fear, keeping Rousey at bay with her powerful kicks and eventually knocking her out in the second round. That's how you cleverly use a fighter's fear against them.
The Preacher's Doctor Hall.
Now let's move on to some of the best fighters and trash talkers in the UFC. Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz. This fight went down at UFC 196 in 2016. McGregor was the featherweight champion and was considered one of the best trash talkers in the sport. But Diaz was not intimidated by McGregor's reputation and entered the octagon with a chip on his shoulder.
Seems with Conor, every fight becomes the biggest of his life.
Conor's looking for that left hand over the top. Nate's moving away and popping that jab.
It was clear that McGregor was afraid of Diaz's ground game during the fight. McGregor had relied on his striking to finish his opponents in the past, but Diaz was a well-rounded fighter with excellent grappling skills. That's when it became clear that the same old tactics wouldn't work. McGregor seemed unsure of how to handle Diaz's ground game and was eventually submitted in the second round. But I'll let that go because I've got something even better. This middleweight champion was scared in a fight where everything was in his favor at first. Anderson Silva versus Chris Weidman. The fight between Anderson Silva and Chris Weidman went down at UFC 162 in 2013. Silva was the reigning middleweight champion.
It's coming from his nose. Big shot at the end of the round.
And was considered one of the best fighters in the world. But Weidman wasn't intimidated by Silva's reputation and entered the octagon with a plan to defeat him. During the fight, it was clear that Silva was afraid of Weidman's wrestling ability. Silva had been dominant in his previous fights, relying on his striking to finish his opponents. But Weidman was a skilled wrestler, and Silva seemed unsure of how to handle his grappling. Weidman exploited this fear, taking Silva down and finishing him in the second round.
UFC
Just like I said before, you really gotta use a fighter's fear against them if you want to win. Still, even the best falter at times. That's what happened during the fight between Jon Jones and Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 165 in 2013. Jones was the reigning light heavyweight champion and was considered one of the best fighters in the world. But Gustafsson was not intimidated by Jones's reputation and entered the octagon with a plan to defeat him. During the fight, it was clear that Jones was afraid of Gustafsson's striking ability. Jones had been dominant in his previous fights, relying on his grappling skills to finish his opponents. But Gustafsson was a powerful striker. That meant that Jones was dealing with a whole other ballpark, and that's all the times UFC fighters were afraid of their opponents.